Hi, I'm Jim, your companion in exploring the intricate depths of attachment psychology and emotional insight. Today, we're diving into a quiet but powerful truth: how someone with a deeply sensitive heart and high emotional intelligence, a super empath, can gradually dismantle the ego of an avoidantly attached person without a single fight, without drama, simply by standing firmly in their self-respect and authenticity. This video is not about blaming or vilifying any attachment style. Everyone is shaped by their pain and unhealed wounds. But when you understand the core behind avoidant behaviors, you stop taking their distance personally, and you stop abandoning yourself, trying to fix what was never yours to carry. This isn't just a breakdown, it's a reminder of your silent power. If you've always been the one who understands, gives, and holds on with hope, this is your mirror. Because when you stand rooted in your worth, no one can manipulate you with distance anymore. At the end of this video, I'll show you how to let go with dignity, to keep your heart intact without losing your compassion. If this resonates with something deep inside you, please subscribe, share this video, and stay with me until the very end. Awakening doesn't have to hurt, it just needs clarity. There's a kind of power that doesn't need to announce itself, but it still makes people tremble. That is the unshakable self-respect of someone deeply empathic. A super empath, intuitive and emotionally attuned, doesn't respond in the way an avoidantly attached person expects. When the avoidant begins to withdraw, go silent, or erect emotional walls to create distance, the super empath doesn't fall into the trap. They don't send a string of anxious messages, they don't scramble to hold the connection, and they don't try to explain or prove their love. They don't measure their worth by someone else's detachment because they already know. Worth does not require validation from someone who struggles to connect. The super empath's silence isn't indifference, it's a conscious choice. They choose to observe rather than react. They lean back, not because they've stopped caring, but because they know the difference between what's theirs to carry and what isn't. And that stillness? It rattles the avoidant. For the first time, their favorite weapon silencio doesn't work. For the first time, they're not in control of the emotional tempo. Avoidants often find safety in distance. It's their way of regulating the emotional climate, of keeping things manageable by keeping people at arm's length. But when they try that with someone who isn't emotionally dependent on their breadcrumbs, the tactic loses its power, and that's when the avoidant's ego begins to crack. The super empath doesn't need to lash out. They don't need to beg or blame. They just hold their ground, and that alone causes an inner shake in the avoidant. That's the moment the avoidant starts asking, why aren't they reacting like everyone else? And the answer stings, because this person will not trade their self-respect for an unpredictable connection. To an avoidant, reaction equals control. But to someone emotionally mature, non-reaction is power. Not power to manipulate, but power to stay conscious, anchored. When a super empath withdraws their emotional energy, it's not to punish, it's to protect. And in that moment, the dynamic shifts. The one who used to control the distance is now the one left in the void. They weren't abandoned, they were seen too clearly. And they realize there's no one left on the other side of the door waiting for them to open it. And just as the avoidant begins to feel their control slipping, something even more disarming awaits them: being seen. Because if quiet self-respect shakes their control, then being read with pinpoint emotional accuracy without judgment begins to crack the ego itself. A super empath doesn't just notice behavior, they sense the deeper layers beneath it. Their emotional intuition is like a sensitive radar, not just picking up on moods but understanding what triggered them. For avoidants, who often mask themselves behind cool detachment, sarcasm, or sharp intellect, this is one of the rare moments they can't hide. Because a super empath's gaze doesn't seek flaws, it seeks truth. When a super empath gently says, I know you're not distant because you don't care, you're distant because you're scared, it doesn't land like an accusation. It lands like a mirror, soft, yet unflinching, reflecting what the avoidant has never dared admit to themselves. And that's what unsettles them. How can this person see me so clearly? The avoidant ego is built on the belief, I don't need anyone. They feel powerful in ambiguity, in withholding, in keeping others guessing. But when they're faced with someone who isn't playing the game and can even name the reason the game exists, the ego has nowhere to hide. This emotional X-ray doesn't aim to control. It's not about superiority. On the contrary, it's the presence of compassion, a desire to understand without the urge to fix. The super empath doesn't want to rescue the avoidant. They simply see them, and that for someone who's lived a life of defenses, the rawest form of intimacy. And that's why the avoidant starts to waver. Not because they're losing a battle, but because they've never been seen so deeply without being abandoned. That kind of precision doesn't make them feel weak, it makes them feel exposed, yet safe. The avoidant world is one built on armor, but the super empath doesn't force their way in, they simply illuminate. And in that light, the defenses begin to loosen, not from threat, but from the quiet invitation to finally put the armor down. And whether they acknowledge it or not, something has shifted. The ego no longer feels invincible. The power isn't all theirs. They've been seen and still accepted. And that, whether the avoidant says it out loud or not, is the first crack in the ice they've lived behind for far too long. But the avoidant's ego doesn't surrender easily. Once they feel exposed, they don't take accountability. They retreat even deeper into their familiar tactics. Emotional distortion. They pull away without warning, keep things vague, speak in half-truths, send breadcrumbs just enough to spark hope only to disappear again. For most people, this creates an exhausting cycle of overthinking, self-doubt, and desperate analysis. But for the super empath, the game doesn't land, because the super empath sees the pattern, not just the moment. They aren't blinded by inconsistency. They no longer stay up analyzing every word or replaying every unread message. When the avoidant goes silent, they don't spiral, they take it as data. And once they've seen enough data, they don't ask for clarity, they become the clarity. That's when the avoidant begins to panic. Their whole approach has relied on ambiguity to control the pace of closeness. They're used to others reacting, panicking, chasing, submitting. But the super empath doesn't react, they withdraw their energy. Not to punish, but because they know any connection without emotional clarity is not worth their emotional investment. And that rattles the avoidant's ego. There's no one left to hold the dance of control, no one waiting for the next chance. The super empath's silence isn't meant to manipulate, but it makes the avoidant feel emptier than ever. Because unlike others who left in anger, the super empath steps back with peace, and that peace is what makes the avoidant realize they've truly lost something. The super empath doesn't need to make a scene. They simply stop playing. They refuse to chase crumbs of connection. They refuse to trade emotional clarity for uncertainty. And in that, they hold the real power, the power of self-ownership. While the avoidant believes that whoever feels less wins, the super empath lives by a different truth. Real strength is not needing control to feel worthy. They don't guilt others into change. They don't need others to behave better to feel whole. They just need themselves whole, awake, and clear enough to say, I don't accept love that comes with confusion. And that's why the avoidant feels like they've lost everything. Not because the super empath made noise, but because they walked away without bitterness carrying, only their awakening. And nothing dismantles an avoidant ego faster than realizing the one person who truly touched them has now let go without needing closure. Perhaps the most painful thing for the avoidant isn't the calm withdrawal, but the way the super empath once stayed. Not out of fear, not out of need, but with an open heart, undefended, unguarded, and untouched by manipulation. And it is this that awakens a deeply buried emotion the avoidant has long tried to suppress: shame. Ironically, the super empath never tried to heal the avoidant. They didn't enter the relationship to play savior, but their presence, peaceful, authentic, and non-controlling, accidentally created a safe emotional space the avoidant had never known. And paradoxically, that safety made the avoidant feel unsafe, because for the first time, they weren't judged. For the first time, they didn't need to act strong to be accepted. But for that very reason, everything they had buried, fear of abandonment, the belief they're unworthy of love, past emotional wounds, rose to the surface. The super empath doesn't just soothe, they become an emotional mirror. And in that mirror, the avoidant sees every part of themselves they've denied. Not through confrontation, not through force, just by existing. They make the avoidant feel seen, and that stirs a deep, unsettling shame. Shame for withdrawing from love. Shame for pushing away the one person who didn't want to fix them, but only to understand them. Shame for hiding behind defenses when they were finally offered something real. This feeling is anything but comfortable. It creates anxiety, confusion, even anger. Not anger at the empath, but at themselves, for not knowing how to receive healthy love when it finally showed up. And to escape this, many avoidants choose the most familiar route. They sabotage the connection. They push away, find fault, retreat behind the mask, because it's easier than admitting. Not everyone wants to control them. Not everyone will leave. But when the super empath doesn't retaliate, doesn't fix, doesn't chase but simply stays true to themselves, the avoidant has no one left to blame. They're forced to look inward. The most painful part is, the super empath once stayed fully, wholeheartedly, but they can't stay forever without mutual effort. And when they leave, they don't just take their healing presence, they take the opportunity the avoidant never seized. The avoidant ego may not admit it, but something deeper knows. They just lost the one person who saw all of them and still chose love before finally choosing themselves. And that kind of loss doesn't need drama or a long goodbye to leave a lasting mark. It stays, like a mirror they can't unsee. And then, the inevitable moment arrives. Not a dramatic breakup, not a final argument, just a quiet departure, no fireworks, no accusations, only stillness, and one person walking away with their heart intact. That's when the super empath leaves. Their exit isn't like anyone the avoidant has encountered before. No guilt-tripping tears, no long monologues, no blaming. They don't leave to punish. They don't stay to provoke a response. They don't even look back to see if the other person finally gets it. They simply leave because they've remembered their worth and they know love should never cost them themselves. For the avoidant, this is the final blow to the egonaut, because they were abandoned in the usual way, but because they were seen, touched, and then let go with a kindness that cuts deep. They weren't punished, they were mirrored. And what stings most isn't losing someone who loved them, but losing the chance to grow through the relationship they couldn't rise to meet. The super empath never needed anyone to realize their worth. They already knew. That's why they don't hurt others to prove it. Their clarity lies in knowing when to walk before they're emptied, before their kindness is mistaken for weakness, before their patience becomes self-abandonment. And it's exactly this kind of silent goodbye that avoidants never forget. Had it been a fight or a dramatic ending, maybe they could dismiss it. But being left by someone who saw all of them and still chose love, that kind of loss stays. Because for the first time, they can't hide behind "I withdraw because I'm hurt." For the first time, they must ask, why did that person walk away so peacefully while I feel so hollow? The super empath's exit is the clearest message. I loved you, but I won't lose myself to hold on to something unhealthy. And that message, even unspoken, echoes in the avoidant's heart, an echo not easily silenced. When they return to silence, it doesn't bring peace like it used to. It no longer feels like a fortress, it feels like a sentence of loneliness. Because the one who once stayed through the cold, who saw them fully, is no longer there. They may not admit it, they may pretend not to care, but deep down, they know. They lost something rare, a love without conditions, a connection without control, a person who never played games, but also refused to be played. The super empath didn't leave because they stopped loving. They left because they started loving themselves more. And that, above all, is the message they leave behind. You don't get to make me betray myself. And in the end, what lingers is not a breakup, it's an awakening. Because the super empath didn't leave to hurt the avoidant. They left to protect the last intact part of themselves. But when they stepped away, not with bitterness, not to teach a lesson, but simply with peace, they didn't leave emptiness behind. They left a quiet mirror. And in that mirror, the avoidant finally saw themselves. No more illusions, no more justifications, no one left to absorb the weight of their ambiguity. They stood face to face with the raw truth of who they had been, no longer shielded by the empath's patience or grace. And in that moment, the ego built from avoidance began to unravel. The absence of the super empath wasn't like any other distance the avoidant had created before, because those distances were always theirs to control. But this space, they couldn't close it. And for the first time, they felt truly powerless. No one left to wait. No one reaching out. No one softening the void they once used to maintain control. And for the super empath, this departure wasn't a defeat. On the contrary, it was a triumph of emotional maturity. Because love doesn't mean endurance without end. Forgiveness doesn't mean allowing harm to continue. They had loved fully, and because of that, They had earned the right to leave. Not because love ran out, but because self-love came first. For the avoidant, if they're brave enough not to turn away from the mirror, that moment becomes a new beginning. Because what shattered them wasn't the empath, it was the inescapable truth the empath reflected. And if they have the humility to face it, they can choose differently, healing instead of hiding. The super empath didn't destroy the avoidant. They simply broke the ego so the heart might have space to emerge. No one can save another, but anyone can be a turning point in someone's emotional evolution. That's what the super empath became, not with noise, not with drama, but with clarity, calm, and never abandoning themselves. If you're the empath, remember, your power lies in your restraint, your compassion with boundaries, and your ability to walk away without resentment. You don't need to win. You don't need to be understood. The fact that you kept your heart clean in a confusing relationship, that is your victory. And if you're the avoidant, and someone like that walked into your life, don't let your ego push them away forever. They didn't come to make you feel broken. They came to remind you who you were always capable of becoming. Love is not a place where we disappear, overextend, or lose ourselves in sacrifice. Real love is where both people get to be fully seen, in safety, honesty, and presence. If you're a super empath, someone who loves deeply, patiently, and sees beauty even in struggling hearts, remember, your softness is not a weakness, it's a rare gift. But that gift deserves to be received by someone brave enough to honor it. Don't waste your light in rooms with no windows. Hold your warmth, but know when to draw the line before it starts to burn you. And if you're the avoidant, the one who once pushed away a real love simply because you didn't know how to stay, don't let your ego whisper, they'll come back eventually. The patience of a good heart has limits, but that loss, if you dare to face it, can be the beginning of your own healing. You don't have to be perfect to be loved, but you do need to be conscious and accountable if you want to keep a healthy love by your side. True connection isn't built on strategy, it's built on sincerity. If what I shared today touched something inside you, please give this video a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and hit subscribe so you won't miss more content on healing, love, and emotional growth. I'm Jim. Thank you for being here. And wherever you are on this journey, I believe it's time to stop running from yourself